I think that's a very, very well-observed critique, and it's a great point, and the answer is yes. We can, should, and will do more. Nau mai, hoki mai, kia the fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Grieve, tōku ingoa. Welcome, Ti here. Welcome, Glenn, to our first ever mailbag episode, and obviously to you, the audience. More, on this episode more than ever. I've always been a big fan of mailbag episodes on other podcasts. You get an insight into the audience's reflections on the general vibe of the podcast and questions that you wouldn't naturally pose yourselves. So this is the first time we've done this, and we got dozens of questions sent in. I've sort of picked and the ones which I thought were the most interesting and addressable. Whenever I meet a Fold listener out in the wild, they're invariably like smart and curious and open, and I think that sort of comes through in the nature of the questions we've got. The way that we're going to work this is Ti here is on mic right through today. He's going to read the questions to us. Some of them are really pointed towards Glenn. In fact, there's a whole section that's very Glenn coded around MediaWorks WBD stuff. And there's a few kind of more journalism related things which I'll have a crack at. But for the most part, we'll both dig in on it. I've grouped them into longer form questions that we'll do in the front half, and then a whole rapid fire section out the back where we'll just try and shoot from the hip a bit more. Let's rip into it. I'm excited.
Okay, kia ora both. First question is from Felicity from Auckland for both of you. Felicity says, I was interested in your observation around the Warehouse Group stopping all media placement. There is also news that France is pulling out of using Microsoft for government use. I wonder if you see this as the start of a wider trend.
It's interesting, right? I mean, those are quite disparate data points, but they do feel connected in the sense that there's something happening with big technology platforms that is partly, we use these things constantly, and how do we know that they're working as well as they say they do, particularly given that they mark their own homework, as is frequently noted. And the second one is the sort of, it's kind of in some ways economic nationalism and in some ways national security. But as the US becomes more belligerent and hostile to people who were former allies, and as these companies get ever closer to the Trump administration for a wide variety of reasons, governments which want to have some separation from that or don't see that the bargain was kept are contemplating, particularly you're seeing a lot in Europe, disengaging from those platforms. And then there's obviously the advertiser piece of it too, that Frankie Coulter, who will appear on this podcast, I've been promised, just taking a time to kind of figure out how. Glenn, what's your view of this?
Thank you for going first, Duncan. Giving me time to think about this. First of all, I'm going to separate the two. So on the issue in France and Microsoft, my immediate thought goes to, I think, nations increasingly are concerned around what the underlying technology that might be powering or driving the economy or government and different things, and the issue and risk of surveillance. And there's growing talk about that in every circle. And there's a really good example recently, actually, just in the last few days in America, where Anthropic, one of the big AI companies, their product is called Claude. They were part of a government panel tender with their AI products being installed in Department of Defense or Department of War, it's now called, contracts. So the AI technology was going to be prevalent anywhere. As part of their response, Claude said, well, we're happy for our technology to be there, but we're not going to partake in anything that involves harming of human life or mass surveillance of Americans. And they were promptly kicked out of the tender response by the US government. So just enormous pressure coming down And you just have to think about all of these big tech platforms. All of them have the most incredible advanced underlying AI technology, and I think there's real concern increasingly amongst government around how far they're prepared to go.
Yeah, and I think that was quite an interesting one, right? Because within minutes, OpenAI, there's a shared origin story between Dario Amodei, the head of Anthropic, and Sam Altman, who's head of OpenAI, and they basically just jumped in and said, we'll do... I think they didn't go quite full noise, you can do whatever you want.
They were pretty close to it.
But pretty close to it, and it did feel opportunistic. There has been a backlash, and on some level, as the Trump administration becomes more and more sort of, it just demands this kind of level of fealty from its partners and bestows both commercial and I think Anthropic was designated almost like an enemy of the state kind of thing. It had only ever been, the designation had only been reserved for foreign companies prior to that moment. So that, weirdly, I think for Anthropic, that's obviously a short-term commercial loss. But if you're a foreign country looking to procure advanced AI that doesn't, wants to be able to trust its partner, the signal of we won't do these things is actually, it might turn out to be positive for them. And I think that kind of polarization, getting down to even the sort of which company you will interact with and what does their value set kind of feel like, is that feels very present now.
Very, very present. And the kind of big geopolitical question sitting behind all of this is, well, if they don't do it and there's a moral position held where actually we're only going to use AI in a really, moral kind of, business progressive, business efficiency type way, and not do these things, and yet, reportedly China are like, we're all in on everything, we don't care. So the geopolitics of it are also really interesting. Just back to the warehouse and Frank's position, do we think this is a trend for the future? I hope so. I really, really, really hope so, because I think as we said on the pod, the courage to pause and understand truly where accountability lies through media platforms and the result it's going to bring an advertiser is so encouraging to see. The world has become incredibly fragmented in the advertising community. Reach is harder and harder to achieve, but ultimately, if people aren't visiting your website and buying product or coming in store to buy stuff, it's failing. And so, what Frank is calling out is I'm going to have a really good look at that and figure that out store by store, and what is the best mix of media, by location. And I think that's hugely encouraging. I do think that just given the scale of the warehouse group and seeing, it'll be a little bit dependent on what Frank does in terms of his next decision, but I do think it will be somewhat precedent setting. Yeah,
the example I think about often is I interviewed Catherine McGrath, the CEO of Westpac in New Zealand. Really, really interesting. Quite a someone who's willing to say things from that position. This was about 18 months ago, about the number of scams that they deal with, their customers deal with, that originate on Facebook, and the way that banks are sort of rightly held to account for those losses, but Facebook never is. And I asked her, would you, paraphrasing here, but I asked her, would you contemplate pulling out if there isn't a change here? And she said we would. That hasn't happened yet, but I think that a move like Frankie's, which is in a very sort of contained retail type space, there's all kinds of, government is probably the biggest one, which we've talked about on here. So I do think that at some point, a really large client will pull out, not just on a media efficiency, what do I know about what's working basis, but also on a being here is a signal to our customers that this is an acceptable place. And, these are, it won't move the needle for Facebook. They are powered by the long tail, not by large advertisers, but large advertisers' engagement with and tacit endorsement of them as platforms is quite key. So I do think that as the sort of world curdles, the way it feels like it is right now, there will be more. We don't know who and how, but this feels like something which is growing for sure. Tiahe, should we go for the second?
Next question is from Kieran for both of you. There is an increasing amount of regulation or pressure on regulation for social media giants, both design-wise, endless scrolling, and use, age restrictions. If the regulation proceeds, this will no doubt lead to a decrease in ad spend on these platforms. Where do you foresee companies using their marketing budgets in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm not convinced it'll lead to a decrease in spend in the first instance. I think what we're seeing happen is 20 years now of research and science going into what is happening to behavior of people that I guess were native to social media during that time and have grown up with it. And there's a lot of incredible books now being written that are informing the legislation that this question prompts. And some of that science, one of the books called Brain Rot, which I highly encourage people to read. It's an incredible book. So I think, yes, there is more regulation and there's going to be more pressure on governments coming through all around the world. I think locally here, our government will still take a watch and see approach to see what other territories do before they do things. But I'm not convinced that the nature of regulation will lead to less spend on those platforms, because they are, for all of the kind of social issues and moral issues we raise, they are incredibly performative in terms of what they do. They are incredibly effective platforms. But what I think will happen is, and it kind of links back to, I think, the previous question we're talking about the warehouse group, is I think there will be more choice made by certain brands around how these platforms are used. I think the platforms will be pushed harder and harder for brand safety, the way, television kind of leads the way on that. So I think that'll be a rising tide, but I don't think there will be less spend. I think the spend will continue to grow.
I would totally endorse that. I think, you just only have to look at Meta's results in recent quarters, and the way that they're deploying AI to throughout their systems is just making it more efficient. And even as there is sometimes it feels like kind of something that is a huge concern to elites and is barely under consideration for the median user, that there is about slop and misinformation, disinformation. Most people who use them globally find these things entertaining and useful, and that plus the rise in tools and the way that it is the turnkey, you can start a business there in minutes kind of effectively. I don't think that will change. I do think that the way that, I totally agree with what you said, but I think they're just unstoppable juggernauts, and there isn't either a regulatory or all of the advertiser boycotts have failed. There are a way for better or worse.
One of the interesting little social experiments, and encourage anyone who's interested in AI and where it's all going to kind of run this experiment, is when you talk to people, and I always ask the question of people going, are you using AI? What are you using it for? And they will often answer and tell me what they're using it for, and then quickly move into, but I'd never use it for this, and I'd never use it as a personal assistant or anything like that. And then as the conversation continues and they're revealing all the different things that they're using for, sure enough, that's exactly what they are doing.
Yeah.
And so the moral perception of what people are doing versus reality is also, kind of bifurcated, right, in terms of how they think of what they're doing versus what they're actually doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Next question comes from not a Google employee, and this is for both of you. They write, you rightfully talk a lot about government intervention at a legislative level, but I think government as a client is an interesting story. There was the COVID spend up as a way to support the media, but where are we now? Where are they spending, and does it mirror commercial organizations? What's the taxpayer like as a client?
I want to return to that last part because that's my favorite piece of the whole question. But in terms of the where are they spending and does it mirror commercial organizations, that's actually something I find super frustrating, is that's not easy information to find out. I had to fight a north of 2-year battle with Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to get even some very top-line indicative allocations from the $100 million spend that came out during the sort of COVID-19 campaigns in 2020 to 2022. and those would just say digital, out of home kind of thing. Like really, really, it was almost farcical how much they got to kind of have a veil of commercial sensitivity there. I personally think when it's taxpayers' money, we should be given more information about where the spend is going, because ultimately, that there's tremendous power in where that money is directed. But for now, whether it's I think ultimately, the minister could change this. That if they felt strongly about it, it just keeps not happening. So they clearly don't want to. But so I don't have a lot of information on that front. But what's the taxpayer like as a client? Glenn, you've been a commercial lead at some very large organisations. Got any insights there?
The hospital pass. Here's a grenade. Just pull the pin and let it off, Glenn. Look, the first thing I would say, let's do some maths here for a second, right? If you think about the total size of the New Zealand advertising industry, we've talked about it before on the show, it's actually growing. But the reason it's growing is because more and more money is going to the international platforms, be it Meta, be it YouTube, be these other things. And yet the local share of that agreement, so the local media companies, that's shrinking. So then if you overlay and go, well, actually the government is probably the single largest advertiser, do the math, it's pretty clear to see what's happening, right? Look, as a customer, they are the government is not one customer. The way media companies work, they are distributed via multiple media agencies, those clients, and so there's multiple engagements happening with multiple parties all of the time. So it's not, you can't ring fence the government in any way. You can't put them together and have a single conversation. And it's also really hard to affect change because the government is obviously at arm's length to the decisions that have ultimately been made. So it is a universal frustration, I think, amongst local media that they can't get more support, but it's also really hard to kind of enact change.
Yeah, there's been talk and even from MPs in and out of government about having a sort of, it's not quite a directive, but a sort of request to spend more with local clients. Nothing ever really seems to come of it. As far as the client side, I've got some experience of it too. The government can be the best client you ever have in terms of really understanding what you're for, being open to kind of creative ideas, and understanding that the sort of the reality of and the way that it should be conceived of, the sort of function of media in a way that's really sophisticated. They can also be completely the craziest client you'll ever have in terms of commissioning stuff that makes no sense. You find yourself having to agree to things that are you're like, this. Sometimes you're like, this doesn't feel like rational use of money, but you are the client, and everything in between. That would be my view on that. Just being diplomatic, was I?
Kind of. The interesting thing about government, just more broadly for media, is just that the multiple hats they do wear in the media ecosystem, right? So we've just talked about advertising. They're an owner of media. They're a funder of media. They're a regulator of media. And they're a supplier of media. So they are literally in every part of the ecosystem, but not collectively the same part.
No, that's right. And the reason that there are 40 different departments or agencies, all of whom have some form of relationship with media, some form of spend, whether that's promoted Facebook post up to kind of lavish TVC. So it is almost too broad to characterise, but I think you see the very best and the very worst of the client side through government personally.
We are going to have, by the way, for those listeners out there that are interested, we're going to have a real world test of just what the government is doing around advertising as we lead into the election. So we're going to see firsthand what's happening on television, what are you hearing on radio, what are you seeing on a billboard, and what are you seeing on social. So we're going to...
That's true. And the parties, unlike the government, do declare where they spend. And so that is a good little read. Great point. Next one, Tia here.
Next question comes from an anonymous listener doing his master's in the UK. Do you guys believe there is a need for structural reform of government funding agencies to take place before legislation can be established to tackle global streaming companies and social media platforms?
I'm going to let Duncan answer that one, if that's okay with you, Duncan.
Yes, absolutely. Look, my feeling is that just as with tax reform, the OECD's long-running base erosion and profit shifting reform that is very frequently pointed to by anyone wanting to make tax adjustments that might better capture the hundreds of millions of dollars which goes offshore barely touched by the IRD. There's a real chicken or the egg thing, which works well for the big tech companies. They can sort of slow roll, or the reform process, because you could reform on the government side, or you could wait for legislative change, or you could wait for tax change. And I think there's good arguments for
all of them,
for going fast or slow on any of those fronts. But I do think you've got to pick one and say we're going to move here and not allow ourselves to be hostage to a process which is in itself scrutinizing things which are changing. Like when that BEPS, base erosion profit shifting work started, half of the biggest companies that they're effectively thinking about now, whether that's an OpenAI or a TikTok, didn't exist or barely existed. And so like there might have been a 5-year period where Google did have an unhealthy dominance, and now it's got more competitive tension. It's just because it's always in motion. If you've made the decision to hold back, it's hard to get involved.
It's and also once you've made the decision, it's almost out of date. And I think the current decisions, I guess, that are being looked at by government aren't necessarily contemplating AI, for example. And so that makes it just incredibly hard to kind of stay ahead of it. Like a good example was, you and I've talked about this lots, Duncan. Do you just declare the international platforms, so the Metas of the world, as being a publisher? Because if you declare them as being a publisher, everything changes.
Everything changes.
But actually, that doesn't deal with ChatGPT or the AI companies coming in, and so.
Though you could equally designate them publishers, by the same token. Sometimes I think we can overcomplicate things that are phenomenally complex, but also can hinge on something simple definitionally. But to directly answer the question, I think there isn't a need for structural reform, i.e. you can do this without having got your house in order. But I think for example, the merger of the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air, which you definitely can't speak to, to me, I'm a long-standing advocate for it, and I think the structural reform will only help you better understand and better see the relationship between your sovereignty, your cultural, creative, informational outputs, and the way that those interact with big tech. So from my side, we absolutely should be doing this. Are we? My understanding is absolutely not, at least not the size of the election, and that probably feels like it will always be true because there's always going to be an election at some point that's visible. We're in the next section now, this big chunky WBD, Sky, MediaWorks thing. So I heard you want to rip into it. This will lean heavily on you, Glenn, but always feel free to duck and throw something to me too.
This question is from Beck for both of you. What is the worst result from the WBD sale for New Zealand media?
Oh, that's a really good question. What is the worst result? The worst result is you are likely going to be paying more money for subscriptions in the future to access your content. It's a very broad brush, but to make that transaction work, as we were talking about on the pod recently, there is a need to drive scale really quickly around a combined platform, and that platform will need to drive revenue very, very quickly. So I would expect when they launch, there will be enticing offers, no doubt, to bring users in, but expect price rises probably more aggressively than what was happening when the content was sitting on Neon in the past.
Yeah, my answer to that would be that any form of really significant consolidation, makes a globalized media environment more sort of bedded in, and therefore whatever the combined Paramount WBD mega brand ends up being, that it'll more closely mirror Netflix, a broadly similar experience, a bunch of original, some content coming off and on platform in different regions, but the larger they are, the more adept they become, so a world where it's Paramount WBD, Netflix, YouTube, and maybe one other, and that's just harder with the best management will and skill for the likes of TVNZ and Sky to compete with, not in the immediate term, maybe not even in the sort of medium term, but give it 10 years, it's just really, really hard to see. And, we won't get into TVNZ's result, but, its headline revenue number was back 12%, and that's a pretty profound drop. And that kind of thing feels like it's harder to resist in this more consolidated world.
The other, I agree with you, Duncan. The other thing, I guess, which is in the medium-term consideration, and when I say medium-term, I'm saying sort of 3 to 5 years, because this is a horizontal integration, so it's a horizontal buy where you're adding similar assets together, so you're consolidating a market in a really big way. So that means there's less buyers of there's less buying, there's less selling. Everything gets consolidated. So for local media in the medium term, again, because of the drive to scale on a combined streaming platform this company is going to have, that means that content's going to be less available to buy exclusively for TVNZ or Sky. So that's going to be an interesting dilemma around what do their entertainment propositions look like in the future in a digital world. As we also spend more time on Netflix and platforms like this one, because I agree with you, Duncan. I think that it's been stated already, they're going to invest heavily in tech. They want a better user experience than Netflix is going to offer. So, and given the volume of content, you have to assume that time spent, they will start to catch one another. And that means if we, me, you, and the public out there are spending more time on Netflix and this combined platform, we are not on TVNZ Plus or the Sky platforms, and therefore where are the local stories going to be told? So there's some big questions coming, I think, in the medium term that deserve some thought.
I totally agree. They are very much not being considered or responded to at a government level, is my verdict on that.
Next question. Anonymous listener asks this for Glenn. You did a deep dive recently into MediaWorks and it finally being debt-free. The story started with TV3, but out-of-home and radio have clearly been the revenue generators for the various shareholders over the years. The question is, was there ever truly space for TV3 in New Zealand?
I love this question. It's quite a challenging one, particularly for you. What do you reckon?
Oh, I mean, I could speak for an hour, I think, on this topic. I mean, when you look at the formation, and we talked briefly about it, all signposts suggested this was going to be profitable, sustainable, competitive. The landscape had finally opened up to allow a commercial player to come in and build a really, really strong business. I think what happened over time, and no one could foresee, if you go back to 1989, no one could foresee forward to 2025 in any accurate way. But what you have seen happen is, in effect, it's very difficult to sustain in a competitive way two major broadcast networks. I think there are things that could have happened earlier on in the regulatory environment and the legislative environment that might have enabled TV3 to have a stronger path going forward. And there are things we've talked about on the show, many, many times. But you have to certainly looking forward, both TVNZ, as Duncan just mentioned, 12% decline in revenue top line this year. And, in the Sky result, they talked about advertising headwinds ahead. We've got an industry that's now in structural and secular decline. So I think, yes, there was room. Was there room forever? No. There was room for a period of time, and that's why you saw TV3 also continue to change hands to try and find the right buyer and the right owner that could add in synergy benefit, and synergy being some kind of cost benefit or revenue benefit that was going to give TV3 sustainability. But certainly, yeah, at the outset, it looked perfectly reasonable, and actually better than reasonable. It looked really good.
Yeah, I mean, you're much better qualified to offer, and it was terrific to answer. Sorry, and that was a great response. My only addition to that would be that there was, for that period of time in the 2000s when it really did feel like it was flying and challenging and innovating, did coincide with a period of having a smart media-oriented owner that didn't have it heavily laden with debt. Whatever 3 has done subsequent to that, it has been in spite of its ownership and in spite of this heavy load on top of it. And I think in some parallel universe where it was sold to another trade buyer and didn't have to operate with those restrictions, not that it would have been easy, but it would have been a really different situation. So I don't think it's fundamental to the market opportunity or to the business as it was run. I think it comes back to ownership and debt, as we alluded to last week.
And the other just little insight for everyone that was out there, the part of the thesis for merging TV and radio and digital all together was that if you create that, uniform scale, that scale is something that's bigger and better than everyone else out there. So that's got to mean something. But actually, when you go back even to those, days in the early 2000s when RadioWorks and TV3 merged to become MediaWorks, the businesses were operating completely separately with different management teams and different go-to-market teams. So there was never any crossover synergy benefit actually happening. That didn't happen until 2015, 2016. And when that did happen, the only real benefit of holding those assets together in a commercial portfolio was at an integration level. So think about shows like The Block, where there would be an execution for a brand on television and on radio. It certainly wasn't in inventory trading or anything else. And so some of those ideas and thoughts around why it would make sense probably didn't stack up.
So we'll now jump into rapid fire. The last question on that is it actually more properly sits in rapid fire. So I'll get you to ask that, Ti, here, and we'll try and bang through this. But as with no more than a minute on each.
Oh, good luck
between us. So let's see how we go. Ti, here, take it away.
Okay, this question comes from Matt for both of you. Is the recently announced HBO Max launch date for New Zealand the end times for Sky TV?
No, definitely not the end times for Sky TV. There is a big question mark over the future of Neon, though.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think their sports portfolio is imposing. It's unimaginable that any of the global players will take a decent chunk out of that. And there's a lot of content out there to buy still, even with it being increasingly locked up. So, no, agree.
This question is from Kev, and it's for Glenn specifically. Infomercials. Who is actually watching these? Who are they aimed at? Who is buying extendable ladders and knives off the TV? Is it simply more cost effective to run infomercials than even reruns of shows they already own or can import?
So 2 parts to that question. Who's watching? So, look, who hasn't had a big night, come home, midnight, maybe pour yourself a late one and you start cooking something, turn on the television, you wake up in the morning and the courier's turned up something you bought the night before, right? And so that happens, and they are incredibly effective. So if you talk to the companies that actually run and produce these infomercials, they are incredibly effective use of airtime to build revenue for these companies. From a broadcaster perspective, when you're looking at very midnight to 6 a.m. type thing, and then sometimes from 9 till midday. When you look at total TV audience, those time slots in particular are the lowest available TV audiences available. And so it doesn't make sense to invest in programming normally into those time slots. And if someone's willing to pay you and kind of guarantee on the long term that you're going to get an income stream, you're going to take it. And it is really, as I say, those infomercials work. If they weren't working, they wouldn't be on the TV anymore.
Next question is from Nigel for both of you. Do you think it's time for usage-based TV streaming, i.e. paying by the hour, not the same amount every month? There are a lot of streaming services competing for customers. If they adopted a usage-based model, we could all subscribe to everything but only pay based on the time spent in front of the TV.
Not yet. So even though there is a lot of talk around the streaming market reaching maturity, I don't think we're there yet. I think it will still grow, and there will still be a continual shift from legacy into streaming. And while streaming is continuing to find its financial model and kind of revenue and profit build, they will continue under the current model because it works. They can put prices up, and you're kind of locked in. I think what is interesting on that question is in 5 years' time, for example, when the Paramount Warner merger is done and that's at scale around the world, that product, Netflix is continuing to compete, Disney are doing their thing, and they're likely to be the big three, and they're going to be competing against YouTube at that point. Are YouTube going to introduce a premium model, and would they go down the path to introduce that kind of commercial innovation? I think they would, and I think that potentially would put pressure back on the global streamers.
I disagree. I think that usage-based is always going to be technically quite difficult across platforms, not unsolvable. But the main thing is I don't even think personally that it's the right way for services to compete, and they don't want that. That's going to be very unstable revenues coming in. So I think it's we usage based. We have for water, we have for electricity. It's where there's a single kind of on-off type commodity. TV is just so much messier and more complex. It's desirable in theory, but I think it's very hard to work in practice.
Speaking of YouTube, Ruben asks both of you, according to the NZ On Air Where Are the Audiences report, YouTube is the single biggest channel for daily reach in New Zealand. However, The Fold rarely talks about YouTube other than as a foil for local media. Do you have any plans to dive more into YouTube or talk to the numerous Kiwi YouTubers that have success on the platform?
I think that's a very, very well-observed critique, and I'm very conscious that my own lack of use of YouTube on a personal taste basis effectively blinds me to the success that so many people here and everywhere have on the platform, the whole culture that it represents. I'm a huge admirer of the company. It's just not to my taste. Therefore, I don't talk about it. But it's a great point, and the answer is yes. We can, should, and will do more.
100% agree. So, you probably won't be surprised. I do follow YouTube incredibly closely. I do increasingly engage with the content on the big screen at home. I'm fascinated to dig into. So in America, for our listeners out there, YouTube is now the preeminent use of the big screen in the home. About 14% of all usage in the US is YouTube, more than any other broadcaster or streamer or anything else, and more than double Netflix, by the way. So it is a very, very powerful platform in the home. We don't know exactly what those stats are in New Zealand. I suspect it won't be near that. But it will be a growing platform. And so we should dig into that. I totally agree. We should talk about it more. There are also some really, really, really interesting things that are happening on YouTube with premium content that I think we don't talk about enough.
Next question is from Anthony Young from Media Lab. Ryan Bridge today, mistake or masterstroke?
Anthony is very much a friend of the pod and runs a great media agency in Wellington. That's an awesome question. I love how succinct it is. I also think it's quite hard to answer yet, but I think if you had to pick that binary category so far, I'd probably be leaning towards masterstroke based solely on that selling that into 3 and 3 now, sort of extending the brand into to different mediums. I don't know when. I think when it was Herald Now, the platform, both from a design and the way that the audience expects to use it perspective, wasn't necessarily geared towards it. But now that it has that sort of second function, I'm leaning towards it being the right call. What do you think, Len?
Hi, Anthony. I agree. As always, a well thought out and direct question. I think I'm going to sit on the fence a little here because for me, it's very insightful that deal actually had to be done with 3 and 3 Now, and it had to increase distribution because on the Herald on its own wasn't enough, and the YouTube audience, I think, has been quite small.
Great point.
Yeah, so I think it's insightful that it has to do that. I always thought that was the right play, by the way, because anytime you create any kind of digital video show, distribution is fundamental to your success. So let's wait and see. The other interesting question is, and I don't know, and I'm sure someone will tell us this, but even though they're going to increase the reach substantially, and that's going to increase the value for advertisers and sponsors and things to come on, who is selling what and where is the money going? I don't know.
I mean, again, like as a non-YouTube user, this might even already be happening, but I suspect it's not. But to me, the logical move would just to be to go live on YouTube and then have clips cut up, served out as soon as possible on there. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe that's planning. Maybe that's a future state. But there's a lot of options created by getting the reps and getting the brand out there. Let's go.
Next question is from Julie Timmins for Duncan. This is in relation to how the major sewage spill in Wellington Harbour, a disaster decades in the making, became the fault of a young Wahine councillor.
Oh, that's a shitty question.
My concern and my question for you is twofold. With an election coming up, how do we ensure that the media operates in an ethical, well-researched fashion, parentheses, like the spin-off?
Thanks, Julie.
And in the event of spreading misinformation/disinformation, will media ever apologise and retract untruthful information? Julie
Timmins, one of our most loyal, long-time supporters at the spin-off and listeners to the fold. So kia ora, Julie. This story, which I must confess, perhaps because it was very, very Wellington focused, I was only grazingly familiar with, but Julie sent through a couple of Substack links that talked about the way that Tamitha Paul had become subject to basically a sustained kind of bloggy type campaign suggesting that she had forced a vote that made councillors effectively choose between funding a cycleway and funding upgrades to sewage. That appears to have been very widely debunked subsequently. I actually personally think that's an example of the media doing its job. You can see RNZ, The Post, Te Ao News, all publishing work that effectively refuted that. There is going to be more sort of campaigning and stuff which is like partially true but not particularly reflective. But I think that my personal feeling about all this stuff is the media will occasionally get things wrong. Sometimes it will get things wrong collectively. Sometimes it won't even acknowledge that particularly well. However, on balance, that happens far less frequently, and the mechanisms for correction are much more present in the sort of news media than in the chaos of social media. And that question, to my mind, would be better posed of those platforms and responsibility, per your designate them publishers idea from earlier, to the platforms with the biggest reach, the biggest power, the biggest economic engines.
The next question comes from Ari Sharp from Wellington, and they write for Glenn. The use of AI in many organizations feels like good tactics but bad strategy. Replace junior staff to cut costs, but in doing so, eliminate the opportunities for staff to develop the skills that are essential to becoming the next generation of leaders. My question, how can newsrooms use AI so it doesn't parch the pipeline of the talent that will become future senior writers and editors?
That's a big question. It feels a little like we're on a slippery slope that is gaining speed in terms of the newsroom utilization of AI content. I mean, I guess a good example, and we debated this a little bit on the show with the Herald at the moment, is how they summarize an article at the top of the article on the Herald. Is that good or bad? Is that detracting from skills in the newsroom, or is it additive? I don't know. Probably only they will be able to answer that question directly. But I think anything with the usage of AI that is able to make a journalist more effective, and a good example is, when a number of journalists that might be doing OIA requests, for example, and literally thousands of pages or thousands of documents are coming back in response to that, using AI to help summarize and therefore make the journalist more effective in their own reporting is an interesting way of how they can start to use that any representation coming from AI that is published is very, very, very problematic. The reason I say it's a slippery slope is you only have to go onto your social media pages these days and see the amount of, we call it slop is the new word, but the amount of stuff that is just fake, clearly AI generated, and appearing as news stories is just going to increase. And as that increases, and it was likely going to drive up increased attention and engagement from its users, it's only going to put more pressure back on newsrooms. The pressure back on newsrooms is going to then, hurt the operating model and the commercial model, which is going to put more pressure back on costs. So it feels like it's a problem without a solution right now. But pleasingly, I think that, the Herald and Stuff and all other newsrooms currently in New Zealand, including the spin-off, might I say, have very clear positions on what they will and won't do in regards to AI, and long may that continue.
The next question is for Duncan from NGO Journalist. In the 2010s, Australia's Walkley Foundation, part of the MEAA, held several festivals of journalism and storytelling called Storyology. The listener has been to 3 of them. Wondering if there is any appetite to inject something similar onto the calendar here.
Yeah, great question. And I haven't been to Storyology, but I have been to other Walkley Foundation events and other sort of journalism and media-related events around the world, and they're so good and so valuable. And the closest thing I can recall here was probably 10 years ago when Nikki Hager had an investigative journalism conference in Wellington. That I think it's a clear gap in the market. I think you could, discuss with other people piggybacking off the Voyager Awards. It would be so beneficial. I think the sort of, the industry's been through this period of profound change. It's changing again. It likely will always continue to. And I think being able to sort of pause, digest, reflect, get together in a non-competitive environment and share things which are of real utility to the community of news and journalism here would be great. If anyone listening works for a funding agency or has any interest in that, I reckon you'd be pushing on an open door if you were to take that to sort of senior newsroom leaders.
Next question is from Anonymous for both of you. Media is one of the most disrupted industries in the world. The global tech giants continue to capture more market share, and many Kiwi-owned media organizations seem unable to compete long-term. What advice do you have for people working in the media industry? Should we jump ship, or is there a path to a healthy future for Kiwi media organizations?
Well, okay. So, big question, really challenging question, and an important one. I think that we have been through an extraordinary period of retrenchment that was exacerbated by some elements of what COVID did at a social level and how the government responded. I also think that there are some very well-run New Zealand media organisations now that have, on some level, right-sized, as painful as that process has been. There's been a huge shift towards audiences funding the media they want to see. That is now reasonably well understood. There are still huge challenges, but there is no part of me that thinks that media, in New Zealand, especially the sort of production side, whether that's journalism or production houses, that kind of thing, will be gone or even have. Personally, I don't think there'll be shocks of the scale that we've had in recent years again in the next few years. So if you are a young practitioner or thinking about it, if you're talented and if you're driven and committed, stay the course. It would be my advice and belief.
Yeah, I agree with that last point entirely. If you're passionate and love our sector and you want to talk about it, feel free to, grab a coffee with Duncan and I think, we're all in, right? Like, we love this sector and we think it's got legs. I think what's interesting is that all of the major companies in New Zealand, the major media companies, most of them have diversified away from being 100% relying on advertising revenue. And I think that is the fundamental point. So when your biggest competitor, the global platforms, growing, you've got to move into a different path. And everyone's doing that. Sky have multiple subscription businesses. NZME, has built the subscription paywall stuff with a Trade Me ownership have now another path to value creation in their operating model. The one that's left isolated, I guess, a little bit at the moment, but not entirely, is TVNZ. But they are obviously bringing in a paywall with sport later this year. So. I think a lot of the heavy lifting has been done in terms of starting to diversify the operating models, which is really, really cool. And what that means is that there's more sustainability in the sector than there's probably ever been for many, many, many years. And so this is a great place to be. It's incredible for young people. And I also do a little bit of work with some smaller media companies that we don't talk much about on the show. But there are a lot of smaller media companies that are growing and finding opportunities in market to create value, and starting, I've got to say, with the customer and the audience or talent in mind first. And it's interesting to see how they're starting to develop their businesses.
The next question is from Tim for both of you. Given that HBO Max will launch in mid-2026 and that, give or take, there are a large number of options for streaming apps, have we now reached peak streaming services?
No. Unfortunately.
Interesting.
I don't think we have. I think that, I guess in terms of the amount of players that enter the New Zealand market specifically, we are close to hitting a ceiling, but around the world, no way. More and more people, I think, will move to streaming, but I think streaming will consolidate on platforms with multiple services perhaps starting to appear on a single platform. I think that I did a lot of research on this a couple of years ago when we were looking to launch HBO Max in Australia and New Zealand. And in Australia at the time, the average consumer had, I think, about 4.1 services that they were signed up to. In New Zealand, it was slightly lower. It was about 3.1. So there's definitely room in New Zealand to start grow. But the challenge is a lot of the services won't come into New Zealand because we're too subscale. So it doesn't actually make sense for them to come in. But no, I don't think we're there yet. I think over the next 5 years will be the time to really answer that question, because I think by then we probably will be close to hitting that ceiling.
It just depends how you define peak streaming services. Is that peak in terms of the total number, or peak in terms of people using streaming services? I think the total number probably has peaked, needs to come down. That like some form of consolidation would be helpful from a consumer perspective. But in terms of the number of people using them, I think that will continue to rise, for better or worse.
Nicholas Burrows writes for Duncan. With at least one significant platform agreement reportedly up for renewal, will we see New Zealand media negotiate collectively or continue to act as individual businesses defending their own shorter-term positions?
Great question, Duncan. I'm very glad you're answering.
Nicholas continues, global platforms are structurally advantaged when dealing with fragmented counterparties, and government often engages with the media as if it were a coherent industry. In a market this small, does fragmented bargaining actually serve anyone's long-term interests, including the companies pursuing it?
That gets the whatever, like a book token for question of the day in my terms, just perfectly phrased. To tie a bow on it, I think the collective bargaining process, which the parts of the New Zealand news media, and there were significant numbers who broke away along the way, was a good, smart, really difficult one, and I commend everyone involved in that, from the lawyers to Chris Jans and David Eisman, who negotiated, to former Senior 9 execs who now run Capital Brief, who negotiated on our behalf. I think all of those people did a terrific job for the local market. I think it was made harder by the fact that some players, most notably NZME, peeled away within the process. I'm sure that Michael Boggs would say he had to act for NZME shareholders, and they got the best outcome as a result. You don't get to test that by knowing what the alternative looked like. The most important part is this. The government often engages with the media as if it were a coherent industry. It's not. It really struggles to get together and align, and there's a whole heap of reasons for that, some of which I've talked about in the podcast. So the short answer is yes, it would be desirable. No, I don't think it will happen.
2 more questions. The second to last one is from Ella, and this is for Duncan. I'm not a journalist, just someone who has been interested in the media landscape since high school. My question is, how many media subscriptions do you think is typical for someone to have? Where does it top out? I'm all for paying for media, but at a personal level, I can't support everything I would want to. I would always wonder what a sustainable level of monetary support is for the average Joe. For me, I am a spin-off member, a Verb supporter, and pay for one Substack, and also supported Ensemble previously, RIP. I do also dip in and out of Substacks/Netflix/Patreons for specific content. I'd love to support more media, such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Post, New Zealand Herald, Otago Daily Times, but it's not really in my budget. It's also not realistic to read and consume all of it.
Really, really great question, and appreciate your support on the spin-off side. That's super challenging, right? In some ways it goes back to what a news version of what the question about, could you have a usage-based thing? And people have talked for years about micropayments as a potential solution there. I think actually, the number is probably for, there'll be a curve here, and there'll be, I'd say, the average person, probably doesn't pay for anything, and there'll be a group like Ella who pay for a number of different things and feel like they get value out of it. I don't know what the number is that is related to income, to utility. Some people can pay for these things through their jobs, but my gut says that given that news subscriptions sit right alongside your sort of TV subscriptions and various other things, the number is at best in the, twos. So, definitely a super supporter in Ella.
Can I just jump in on that one, Duncan? Because I think there was a really interesting point that Ella made in her question, and she talks about dipping in and out. She dips in and out, and that is by far the prevalent now behavior you've seen around the world in subscription businesses.
Especially with streaming, right?
100%. And news is different because people will stick around, but anything, even Substack, different things where people will dip in and out. But, and it's, I think, a really good thing for the consumer to do is that, there's only so much time and you've only got so much money. So, of course, it makes sense that you would dip in and out. From a business point of view, that is so difficult to manage because there is no predictability to your future kind of business, the revenue line, the customer line.
And you have to keep spending to kind of revive a customer that won't be around for much longer. So I do think that news by its nature encourages a more stable long-term relationship, whereas you can have a month on Netflix, hoover up all the shows you're interested in, and dip back out. I'm very self-interested in saying that, but I think hopefully people understand that, Netflix isn't going anywhere. If you dip in and out of Netflix, that's not great for Netflix, but it probably doesn't remotely impact the quality of it. Your dollar in a local context, makes an enormous difference, even aggregating a few hundred people kind of thing who behave similarly to you. So, hopefully that again is reasonably widely understood now, and notwithstanding my huge conflict of interest on this, there are more Ellas in the world, in New Zealand, who understand that they do keep the lights on at local media organisations.
Yep.
Last question for today comes from Jean-Baptiste from Australia. Hello, Duncan and Glenn. In Australia, there is an alternate scene in media to the big players, with digital independent publishers, part of the DPA for the most part, and hyper-local independent newsrooms federated around the new LINA alliance. Except for the spin-off or the platform, does New Zealand have such an ecosystem, and if not, how could it nurture it further?
I think there are more players in that space. Newsroom itself being the most obvious one, but there are a number of smaller digital publishers. I think that the natural place where all of the energy and action here is on the publisher side, i.e., largely the written word, is on Substack. But there are as again previous questions have alluded to, there's a big YouTube scene. There are creators on different platforms. I don't think we certainly don't have, with the exception of Crux and some other largely Substack-driven publications, we don't have that sort of hyperlocal media to the same extent, unless I'm missing it, which is possible. but some of that's just our geography, our population base and density. So, there doesn't seem to be as much as you might hope for, and certainly there aren't those umbrella organisations. Again, unless they're just having a party and not inviting us at the spin-off, which is possible. But it would be desirable. I think getting in a room is always good.
Hi, Jean Baptiste. I know who has asked the question, so g'day.
As do I.
I think the big issue in New Zealand, because you're drawing the comparison to Australia, look, it's just scale, right? We just don't have the scale to build audience and therefore commercial pathways the same way that exists in Australia by being or having a more independent publisher. Not to say that the ideas aren't there and the thoughts not there, but building the model around it is really, really difficult. I think Duncan and I are really both on the same page that we encourage everyone to kind of get into the space and find those partnerships and find those paths forward, because we think it's very important for local media, but also for good, healthy democracy, right? To have a diverse view of voices out there. But I don't think we'll ever get to the same scale as Australia.
And that is us for today. That was beyond my wildest dreams, to be honest. I loved the questions. I really appreciate you, Tia, here for voicing them for us, but particularly to those who submitted questions, whether we did or didn't get to them. It was so cool to read and to be challenged and to have these kind of thoughtful questions come through. It's a credit to the audience. Thank you, Glenn, for doing this with me, and we will do it again. I would say like at least a couple times a year. I think it just shakes out some really interesting perspectives. So thanks, Tiahia, thank you, Glenn, and thanks most of all to the listeners for putting this one together.
Thank you.